Good afternoon. I have a small confession. I've become a professional translator for the sentence, I'm fine. You see, every semester when I ask my students how they're doing, they never say, I'm fine. You know what they say? Example? Throw me an answer. Right. They almost never say, I'm fine. They say things like, I'm vibrating at a frequency of pure anxiety. Or they say things like, I'm overthinking my overthinking, and my most personal favorite, I'm not sure why I'm stressed, but I'm doing it very efficiently. But those students are not weak. They're bright, they're multilingual, they are globally mobile Gen Z students navigating university life in a multicultural context. I'm Dr. Rodrigo. I work in higher education. I teach, I design curriculum and assessments, and I study how students adapt, cope, and grow. Not when things are ideal, but when things are messy, public, and uncomfortable. For over 2 decades, across classrooms, institutions, and cultures, I have watched students learn content, but more importantly, I've watched them learn themselves. And so today, I would like to share with you that one quiet skill that shows up long before leadership, long before success stories are written: resilience. Yeah, you can see resilience. In education, we talk about resilience like it's a personality trait. Like it's either you have it or you don't. We measure outcomes, we reward confidence, we celebrate the product. But what my data showed was something different. Resilience didn't look like confidence. It looked like showing up while you're still doubting yourself. It looked like trying while you're being anxious. It looked like regulating stress in messy, imperfect ways. And many other studies have also noted similar patterns of resilience. And so, instead of asking, how do we measure resilience? I ask a different question. Where does resilience actually get built? I study resilience not by interviewing CEOs alone, but I study it through listening to students. University students who are balancing academic pressure, family expectations, money worries, fear of failure, and often all at once. So if you talk about leadership, if leadership starts anywhere, it starts here. So, across multiple sections and 5 prompts across an entire semester, I analyzed over 1,000 reflections of students. And those were not polished essays. They were honest responses to prompts. Students were writing things like, my heart beat so fast before presentation, or I felt like I wasn't good enough, or with all honesty, I continued scrolling social media, although I know it would make things worse. Those were honest human data. And one thing became clear very quickly. Resilience is not confidence. Students kept showing up while being overwhelmed while being unsure and anxious. That persistence without certainty, that's what we call resilience. And here's one thing that surprises me also, is that students already know what helped them regulate: talking to a friend, journaling, going for a walk. But when under pressure, they forget. And they fall into avoidance. They're doom scrolling, they're skipping sleep, and sometimes shutting down. And so this tells us something critical, that before leadership, before performance, comes regulation. An overwhelmed body cannot lead. And so as I coded these data, I noticed something interesting. I wasn't seeing students' stress responses. I was seeing students rehearsing leadership behavior, often without realizing it. And across different sections, different students, and different situations, an adaptive pattern kept emerging. And that pattern is now I call steady. It's not a personality trait. Steady describes what students can do when the learning environment allows them to regulate, to make mistakes over and over again, to continue under pressure. And here's what's important. Steady does not emerge in outcome-based assessments. It emerges in performance-based assessments. So as you can see, steady is a pattern, not a personality trait. The very first thing that students showed me almost immediately was that S for steady is self-awareness. They knew when they felt anxious. They noticed their negative self-talk. They are able to name the pressure in their mind and bodies. But what they didn't always know was that how to do about it, what to do about it. And this matters. You know why? Because resilience does not begin with control. It begins with noticing it. And in leadership can begin when someone can say, I knew something was off and I knew it was me. And here's where leadership gets a little bit uncomfortable. Students didn't wait to feel confident, to feel ready, to feel confident before acting. They submitted their assignments while they're doubting themselves and their work. They delivered their presentation despite being anxious. That is what we call tolerance of discomfort. Resilience isn't feeling ready. It is staying in the room when you don't. Now, any adaptive leaders that you admired learned this early. Progress often comes before confidence. Now, here's another important thing. E in steady, emotional regulation. Students didn't regulate emotion in polished textbook ways. They didn't say, I applied a formal regulation strategy. They say things like, I went for a walk. I talked to a friend. I listened to music. Regulation was social, messy, human. Resilience lives not in perfection, but in connection. And here's what I think that what students did next, which was quite powerful, I would say. They adjusted. They rewrote drafts. They changed their study strategy. They tried and tried again differently. Adaptive action is the moment when resilience becomes visible. Not success, not failure, but the willingness to respond, revise, and re-engage. That is leadership in motion. And this is one myth that we need to retire, especially in leadership. The idea that resilience is a solo act. Based on my data, students depended on their teams, friends, classmates, and family. They borrowed strength while rebuilding their own. So any leaders who understand this don't ask, how strong am I? They ask, who am I connected to? In short, resilience, it turns out, is rarely individual. It's distributed. And here's the turning point, the part where most educators often underestimate. Resilience grew strongest when students knew their contribution mattered, when their name was written, when a team depended on them, when effort becomes visible. And this is where performance-based assessment changes everything. When students are accountable not just for the outcomes, but for their participation, the process, their contribution, resilience stops being abstract. It becomes practiced. And that's how future leaders are shaped. And as you can see, leadership does not arrive when confidence, or does not begin when confidence arrives. It begins when the learning environment allows students to respond, make mistakes, regulate, and again continue under pressure. Steady, the pattern that I just showed you, is the behavior it produces. So as educators in the crowd, it's time for us to ask ourselves a harder question. If we want adaptive leaders of the future, what are we actually training students to do? But before I answer this question, let me clarify the difference between performance-based and outcome-based. Have you heard of these before? Outcome-based and performance-based, they're not opposites. They work together, but they play different roles. Outcome-based is the framework. It answers the question, what can the students do at the end of learning? While performance-based answers the question, what does that ability look like when students are actually doing it? And as you can see, it does not replace, performance-based assessment does not replace outcome-based assessment. It operationalizes it. Now, in a well-designed curriculum, the learning outcomes don't just sit on the core syllabus. They define what matters. For example, skills, leadership skills, critical thinking, collaboration. They define what matters. And here's why performance-based assessment is very important, because when students, again, are accountable for their actions, the learning outcomes do help us see or measure where those learning outcomes are demonstrated through performance-based assessments. So performance-based task gives situations or gives students the authentic situations where those learning outcomes must be demonstrated. And here's why it's important for resilience. It's because in resilience, if we assess students only through outcomes, failure feels final. But if students are assessed, or if learning is assessed through performance, effort, iteration, contribution, resilience stops being an abstract goal. It becomes something what students learn by doing. So, the key takeaway of this talk is that if we want adaptive leaders in the future, we don't just teach resilience. We design for it. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is through performance-based assessments that allow students to keep staying steady again and again. So let me leave you with this question. Where, in our teams, in our classroom, in our organizations, are we measuring outcomes when we should be building adaptability? And remember, learning or resilience stays when learning requires action, contribution, and reflection. That's just how we grow, not just as students, but as adaptive leaders for uncertain times. Thank you.